Mr. Jaishankar, thank you so much for joining us. This time we decided that we are going to let our guests speak to you through the session. Lots of folks had questions when the last panel got over. They were not addressed. Maybe you can answer those as well. You could also, some of those interesting issues that were raised could also be addressed. But before we move to the audience and their engagement with you in this particular format, in these 2 years where we've seen so much happen, from the pandemic to political action to disruptions to wars to invasions to threats, what are the three things that would keep you up at night? What keeps you awake? What keeps you engaged?
Well, to be honest, the only thing which keeps me awake at night is jet lag occasionally, but not too often actually. But if I were to think of three things, I think one, the shocks that the international order has been experiencing. Because if you were to look at the last 3 decades, globalization, spread of technology, these were even the rebalancing, the prosperity, the high growth rates in Asia particularly, these were the dominant trends. And in particularly the last 2 years, since we've had the last physical meeting of the Raisina Dialogue, we've really had some big shocks. COVID was a shock. Afghanistan was a shock. Ukraine is a shock. In a sense, the sharper friction between big powers, between the West and Russia, between the United States and China, these two have added to it. So I think I won't say it keeps me awake at night, but certainly it's something which anybody doing foreign policy needs to spend a lot of time trying to get the world right. The second point I would make is, if you are trying to get the world right, you obviously need operational metrics to respond to the world which is changing. So how do you keep, how do you develop that? How do you update that? How do you course correct? And in our case, we have, especially since 2014, 2015, roughly the same time as Raisina actually has come into being, we've had a much greater clarity about how we engage the world. We've done it in a sense in concentric circles. There's a neighborhood first. There are these extended neighborhoods in Southeast Asia and the Gulf, in Central Asia. There's a very conscious policy of engaging all the major powers simultaneously in a world, in a policy which Shashi claims credit for, called multi-alignment. We still haven't quite agreed what the word should be. I would say also, how do you develop a larger global footprint? But to do all of that, the third issue is, how do you develop the capabilities? I think Jay Panda before referred to Atmanirbhar Bharat, a more self-reliant India. Self-reliant not just in capabilities, but self-reliant in mindset, and self-reliant in terms of shouldering greater responsibilities. But again, you need a narrative that would accompany that, a narrative in a sense of a new India. So therefore, to me, getting the world right, issue number one. Developing the operational strategy to deal with that world, issue number two. And then developing the capabilities and the narratives to deal with that. That would be my three big ones.
So, Dr. Jaishankar, as agreed, we will turn to the audience straight away.
Sure.
And I think we have esteemed guests with us today. And I'm going to first invite the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Norway, Minister Hudfield, to pose the first question to you. My colleagues will get you the mic.
So, thank you. A main draw of the Raisina Dialogue is that it is hosted by the world's largest democracy. Russia's aggression towards Ukraine is an example of an authoritarian state attacking a democracy. Indeed, many would say that Russia attacked Ukraine precisely because it's a democracy. How does India, as the world's largest democracy, see its role in defending free societies globally?
Well, I think in a sense some of that was debated in the earlier panel. I think where the conflict in Ukraine is concerned, we have a fairly clear position that has been articulated, a position which emphasizes the urgent cessation of fighting, which urges a return to diplomacy and dialogue, which stresses the need to respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. But since you raised it as a larger issue, I do think this is an issue of concern, not just for India, because the fact is that there are different countries who in a sense evolve a combination of values, interests, history, experience, culture to approach conflicts and specific situations. You spoke about Ukraine. I could also, I remember less than a year ago what happened in Afghanistan, where an entire civil society was thrown under the bus by the world. Or we in Asia face our own sets of challenges, which often, I would say, impact on the rules-based order. So, I would say, quite honestly, all of us would like to find the right balance of our beliefs, of our interests, of our experience, and that's really what we're all trying to do. And it looks different from different parts of the world. The priorities are different. That's quite natural. But as I said, at the moment, these shocks are really for all of us to be concerned about, because each of these events, Afghanistan, COVID, Ukraine, big power rivalry, have global consequences, and consequences for the everyday person.
So let me turn to the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Luxembourg, Minister Asselborn, and invite him into this conversation.
So my question is, dear colleague, we know that a few weeks ago, Sergei Lavrov, who was appointed in 2004, same year as myself, he was here in Delhi. Can you tell us a little bit the justification of what Russia is doing in Ukraine? We heard in Europe always a denazification, and then also to prevent the genocide of Russians in Ukraine. So really the justification of such a military intervention after the 24th of February this year, how does he explain it to you? He is a diplomat. He was represented Russia, even the Soviet Union before, in New York. He is minister since 18 years. And I think everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine is really against international law and also the Charter of the UN. Thank you.
Well, look, if you want to know the justification of Russia, that's for Sergei Lavrov to do. I'm prepared to justify what India's views are on Ukraine or any other matter. I recognize today that the conflict in Ukraine is the dominant issue, if not among the dominant issues of the day. And it's a dominant issue not just in terms of principles and values alone, also in terms of the practical consequences of it, the knock-on effects. The truth is, there is really nobody who wants to see this conflict. I mean, there will be no winners out of this conflict. But I also stress, and I say this to you because both of you are my European colleagues, and I understand that at this moment, this would probably occupy you to the exclusion of almost everything else. But there is also a world out there, and I'm very glad that you're sitting here in India, because it would remind you that there are equally pressing issues in other parts of the world. I mentioned Afghanistan. I mentioned the challenges which we faced in Asia. And if I were to put those very challenges in terms of principles, I mean, when a rules-based order was under challenge in Asia, the advice we got from Europe is do more trade. At least we're not giving you that advice. And in terms of Afghanistan, I mean, please show me which part of the rules-based order justified what the world did there. So let's I think see this in the right context. Our position is that we all have to find some way of returning to diplomacy and dialogue. And to do that, the fighting must stop. I think that is really the focus of what we are trying to do.
Let me move away from Europe to another. Minister Loxin, can we have the mic here? Can we have the mic, Aditya, to Minister Loxin, please? Yeah. Thank you, Aditya.
I think this issue of genocide should be put in this context. When asked of India, you're talking about the country that sent an army to prevent the extinction of the people who would later become Bangladesh. I remember that because I was young. André Malraux, in his grandiloquent way, said he would form a legion to fight there as they had fought in the Spanish Civil War. So this is India, the country that answers the call when people are facing genocide. Thank you.
Can I return to the minister from Madagascar, Richard Randria Mandarato? I hope I got the name right. Nearly.
Yes, thank you. I'm from Madagascar, West Indian Ocean island, next to Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros. And my question is regarding the Indo-Pacific vision and ambition that we both share. To start with, let me point it out that India and Madagascar made the same choice as regard to Ukraine. We voted abstention, if I may say so. So we have something in common. But my question as regard to this vision of Indo-Pacific, how do you see the leadership of your country, if we may take it as a leadership, natural leadership, because your country is so big compared, for example, to Madagascar? How do you see it, and where do we start? How do we materialize such a vision from the West Indian Ocean perspective? Because we spoke about, the Chinese and that part of the Indo-Pacific. But from the west side of Indian Ocean, how do you see that, Mr. Minister? Thank you.
Can I just add something to that, sir?
Please.
Is there now a more broader consensus that the Harry Harris definition of the Indo-Pacific from Bollywood to Hollywood is no longer valid, and perhaps it has to go to the Western Indian Ocean as well? Is that a more broader acceptance of that idea?
Well, yes, except that Western Indian Ocean is not alliterative with Bollywood and Hollywood. So I think you need a catch phrase out there. But no, I think the minister's question is a very valid one, because there are really 2-3 sets of forces at play here. I think one, as Indian Ocean countries, we need to, in a sense, recognize and reclaim our history. That we were a very vibrant, pluralistic ecosystem for the passage of commerce and culture for many, many years. Now, this was disrupted during the colonial times. And I think as part of today the changing world, a much more globalized world, a much more rebalanced world, how do you rebuild our economies? How do we actually do more interactions with each other rather than go through intermediaries of a very different era? And in that sense, recreating the Indian Ocean, I would say, I'm using community with a small c here, and also how do we look for solutions amongst each others? In 2015, Prime Minister Modi actually put forward a vision called Sagar, which is literally a word, it's an acronym, but it means ocean, which was security and growth for all in the region. And that's been, in a sense, the template by which we have really stepped up our cooperation with a lot of countries, including Madagascar. And now, where the Indo-Pacific is concerned, I think there's a slightly different issue there, which is that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean have become much more seamless because countries on either side of that imaginary divide are actually have political, security, and economic interests, and therefore it's actually untenable to see them in compartmentalized terms. So that's, I would say, a larger geopolitical happening which is taking place. And to me, the two are completely sort of reconcilable. A stronger Indian Ocean activities actually contribute to the Indo-Pacific as well.
So let me stay with the Indian Ocean and let me turn to Minister Amina Chona.
Minister, I am representing the Maldives and I'm the Environment Minister as well. And climate change is an existential threat for us. I do believe the commitment made by India in COP26 is by far one of the most ambitious mitigation targets we heard. And I also understand how complicated energy transition is for India, particularly because we still have millions without access to power. And development is a necessity for India and for South Asia as well. But climate change, as I said, is an existential threat. I don't think it's just for small island nations like the Maldives, but even for India. Sure. We have the highest mountains in South Asia. We also have small island states like us, which is one of the lowest countries in the world. We don't have a higher ground. So my question is, as we enter into a world which is complicated by energy, conflict, and issues like this, we also have climate change before us that we can't wait to address these things until countries are comfortable to deal with it. So how do you see climate politics will evolve given the nature, given the urgency of this issue that we have? Thank you.
Well, you know, from the Indian perspective, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything you said. And from the Indian perspective, there are two parts to this issue. One is climate action, and I look at it in terms of what we ourselves do, and the other is climate justice. And we need both, which is everybody needs to do the utmost that they can, but also ensure that there's the more vulnerable, the more exposed, the less resourced countries and societies are actually supported in this challenge. Now, we all know the story of climate change, how there have been repeatedly the promises of resources which have been given in COP after COP have not been kept. But at the same time, because others are not keeping the word, doesn't mean you don't do what you can do and will do. And that's the approach which we have taken. From our point of view, if you look between, I would say, it's now 6 years since Paris happened. we are probably among the few G20 economies which have actually kept to our Paris commitments. And we are careful about making commitments. We don't overpromise. We try, but we are sincere about what we promise. So I'm pretty confident that what we have committed to do in COP26, we will do. In terms of the challenges which small island developing states are facing, for us, that comes right on top because they are actually the most vulnerable. Whether it is, many of our initiatives, the International Solar Alliance Initiative, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Initiative, some of the newer initiatives that we tabled at COP26 are actually aimed at highlighting the predicament of small islands.
In terms of upping its role in trilateral relationships, and you spoke about helping within sub-communities or community with small c. And how can India actually help the Indo-Pacific region, and more specifically the SIDS, and more specifically Mauritius? Thank you.
Let me actually give you a set of answers. One, let's look at the immediate crisis we are facing, the knock-on effects of the Ukraine conflict. As I said, one impact of that we see in energy prices, but one we see in terms of food shortages and food inflation. And India can make a difference today by stepping in terms of export of agricultural commodities, especially wheat, and that is the case. We are trying to see how we can supply more wheat to meet global shortfalls. There are, of course, some constraints here, which is that what we have in terms of public stocks, there are WTO limits on trading with those stocks. But this is a very unusual situation, so we hope that the WTO would look at it in that manner. But if we can contribute today to alleviate food shortages, whether it's it's government purchases, expanding the markets, helping the World Food Programme, I think this is a very big contribution that we can make, and we are prepared to make that. In terms of something longer term, we've always had a history of South-South cooperation. Even when our resources were less, our income levels were lower, we've always tried to do, we tried to share what we could. It's been visible in terms of projects, in terms of training, in terms of education, and in terms of sharing experiences and best practices. Now that has steadily expanded as we have become bigger. In the case of Mauritius, there are some very good examples of that development partnership. The metro in Mauritius, the Supreme Court in Mauritius, social housing projects. These are all good examples, and I can pretty much cite that across a very large part of the developing world. I think today, if I were to look in terms of our development projects, I think probably there are about, my rough memory is about 65, 70 countries in the world where we have done development projects, which would actually be close to almost 1,000. So when I said that, to me, self-reliance is not just having more capability at home, it is also bringing that capability to play in terms of larger global requirements and development.
Thank you.
Let me perhaps now move to the Americas. Let me move to the Americas now. I don't know if the Minister from Argentina would like to ask a question to the Minister.
His past.
Or maybe I should go to my young fellow Diego, who was formerly a politician in Peru. So maybe because he could bring you, he could take you to a region that we normally don't speak about.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diego. I'm from Peru. Raisina young fellow. Very happy to be here today. That's right. I think that during your intervention, you mentioned a lot about the tensions between the West and Russia, your relationship with the neighborhood, South Asia, Central Asia, but nothing about Latin America. So I would like to know more about what is your objective with respect to this region of the world. What role can India play in the region? And also vice versa, what the Latin countries could do more with India and together in the global governance. Thank you.
A good example of what we are of the relationship we have with the region, actually, I could think of in terms of the minister who didn't ask the question, my colleague from Argentina, because when I met him, we actually discussed today the doubling of trade which has taken place between India and Argentina. That again, these are interesting globalization consequences of conflicts. Ukraine was a very big provider of edible oil, sunflower oil, to India. So one of the many consequences of the conflict in Ukraine is that those supplies have been cut. Now, Argentina has emerged as one of our biggest sources of edible oil, soya oil, largely in that case. So I think that era where distance meant indifference is behind us. Today, if you look in terms of what, the economic benefits and I would say the political commonalities in terms of the technology, bridges. A lot of our IT companies, for example, have a very large footprint in Latin America. My colleague from Colombia, whose ambassador is sitting here, reminded me that the second largest two-wheeler export by India is actually to Colombia. So there is actually, it's very interesting that often things happen on the ground. The debate doesn't necessarily capture it initially, but I would say perhaps for next year, maybe we should have a greater focus on how India's relations with Latin America and maybe Latin America's relations with Asia have expanded in these years.
I'd like to turn to the subject of economics, which also is very strategic for the Indo-Pacific region. As you know, after India withdrew, for a good reason, from the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in 2019, it's launched a series of bilateral agreements, including concluding one with the United Arab Emirates and with Australia. But at the same time, China is aggressively following a regional strategy, leading the RCEP countries, and also has applied for membership in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's pursuing its Belt and Road Initiative. Is India giving thought to approaching the region economically in addition to on a bilateral basis? And if so, by the way, through what mechanisms?
Well, I think you're right that in the last few months, we've actually made some significant progress in bilateral FTAs. We've concluded 2 of them with Australia and with the UAE. We hope that after, especially after the visit yesterday of President von der Leyen, that our European Union FTA and other negotiations will pick up greater speed. We are very confident that after Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit a few days before that, that our FTA with UK will gather steam as well. So definitely on the bilateral side, there is a lot of activity which is going on. Your question, are we also thinking regionally? Well, to some extent, we have regional FTAs. We have a FTA with ASEAN. So we are discussing an FTA with the GCC as a group. We have a long-standing discussion with Mercosur. So those are in play. But we also, looking beyond the orthodox way of engaging. Yesterday, among the agreements which were reached were a Trade and Technology Council launch with the EU, which we have to work on and see. And I think that would be very, very helpful for a deeper engagement with the EU on resilient and reliable supply chains, on more, on development of trusted technologies. And with the United States as well, when I was there in Washington and with some of my economic colleagues, again, there are discussions underway whether there are new ways of engaging, not necessarily through an FTA mechanism. There's something more contemporary, something which would be which would be more practical and more acceptable to the current political circumstances. So it is very much in play.
Can I now ask my colleagues to take the mic to Prime Minister Carl Bildt? Carl, would you like to pose a question? The mic is right behind you. Aditya. Yeah. Thank you, Aditya.
Thanks. A lot about Ukraine, but I would say that Ukraine is also about other things. It's also about China. And the worries that we have from, say, the European point of view, if I can express that, is that others might draw conclusions from what's happening, and that's dangerous. So my slightly difficult question to you, and I can see it can be difficult to answer in public, what conclusion do you think China will draw from what's happening? Do they see that there's a possibility to do things that otherwise would not be allowed? Or do they think they will draw the conclusion that, well, the international reaction is so strong that we might be forced to restrain ourselves? And I think that's a critical question, because the conclusions China draws from this will have major repercussions for the security, not primarily of Sweden, but perhaps even more for India.
I'm tempted to say, as I did to your colleague, that you should be asking Minister Wangi that question, but he's not here. Look, let me say this, because I can't honestly answer that question. But I don't think international relations necessarily functions by precedence. People don't need to see something out there and say, aha, that's what I'm going to do. I mean, that's how mostly bureaucracies function. But I think world affairs has a sort of a much more self-driven, self-calculating way of working. In terms of, because again, quite candidly, we've been hearing for the last 2 months a lot of arguments from Europe, saying, there are things happening in Europe and Asia should worry about it because these could happen in Asia. Guess what? Things have been happening in Asia for the last 10 years. Now, Europe may not have looked at it. So this could be a wake-up call for Europe, not just in Europe. It could be a wake-up call for Europe to also look at Asia. So there have been, this has not been an easy part of the world for the last decade. This is a part of the world where boundaries have not been settled, where terrorism is still practiced, often sponsored by states. This is a part of the world where, the rule-based order has been under continuous stress for more than a decade. I think it's important for the rest of the world outside Asia to recognize that today. It's not the problems are going to happen. The problems have been happening.
Let me bring in one of our young fellows again to, in a sense, conclude and cap this session. So
sure.
Let me invite Lucas Lamberti from Germany for the final questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a privilege being here. My name is Lucas Lamberti. I work at Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Berlin, and I'm also a young fellow. So yesterday, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she mentioned the EU Global Gateway Initiative, and she spoke about it. So I was wondering, in which fields do you see potential for cooperation for India with regard to this initiative? And what do you more general expect
The Global
from it?
Gateway Project. She mentioned the Global Gateway Project.
Yes.
And let's add some spice to it. Will it have the same traction as the BRI, for example? or is it going to end up becoming a complementary support system for the larger projects underway in that particular initiative? So I think the future of the Global Gateway, the future of some of our own initiatives.
Well, we discussed that yesterday, and we have been very interested in how the EU is taking forward a Global Gateway, because on the issue of connectivity, it's very interesting. If you remember, Samir, I think it was our 2016 Raisina, where somebody out there, standing out there, asked me a question on the issue of connectivity and the issue of Belt and Road. And we've been very, very clear on the importance of market-based, transparent, consultative connectivity initiatives. It took us a few years to convince the rest of the world to come around to that viewpoint. So today we are very pleased to see, I mean, it could be the Global Gateway, it could be Build Back Better, it could be other initiatives. We ourselves, promote connectivity initiatives in the neighborhood and beyond in a very substantial way. So, we do need today to find ways of working together. I say this, for a large part of the world, there was a earlier conversation on liberalism. But I think if I were to take the most expansive view of what is the democratic space, I think it's important. Within the democratic space, we recognize the diversity of that space, and we find better ways of working together on the big issues of the day. It could have been COVID. I think we missed the bus there a bit. But it certainly is connectivity. It definitely is climate change. Today, India is prepared to step forward in a much more substantive way on the big global issues, including in the multilateral arena.
So since you're in such an expansive mood, next year, Raisina, what could be the 2 or 3 big topics that you think would be important at that time? That's it. I mean, I'm being a little...
No, I know, you can't resist being provocative, but I think I will resist that answer.
Great. Excellent. So please join me in applauding the Foreign Minister for his wonderful interaction. And we'll take a 15-minute break and we'll be back for another conversation, this time on green transition. So thank you very much for joining us this morning.